Outside, the mountain is screaming. A savage, sub-zero gale rips through the isolated valley, tearing mature pines straight out of the frozen earth. The air itself has turned into a weapon of solid ice, blinding and lethal. Yet inside the cabin, an old man sits in absolute dead silence. He listens calmly to the terrifying roar above his head. He does not flinch as the wind violently slams against his walls. While his neighbors pray for their lives beneath shaking timbers, he simply watches a single candle flame burn completely still. The massive, ugly mountain of dirt resting on his roof is not collapsing. It is anchoring him to the earth. For 3 long months, the village of the High Mountain Pass laughed at Gunnar. They watched from their warm porches as the eccentric old carpenter dragged heavy slabs of thick, wet turf up a shaky wooden ladder. They mocked the strange, inverted layers of pale birch bark he meticulously laid down first, turning the smooth skin of the trees upside down against the rough timber beams. To the traditional builders of the valley, his creation looked like an absolute monstrosity. It was a chaotic, heavy mound of living weeds, rotting soil, and thick green moss. The villagers prided themselves on their sleek, modern, steep wooden roofs. Their roofs were clean, built from expensive shaved pine designed to let the heavy winter snow slide off effortlessly to the ground. They warned Gunnar that his foolish, primitive experiment would rot his structure by spring. They told him the immense weight of the wet peat would eventually crush him in his sleep. But Gunnar only wiped the freezing sweat from his brow and kept digging into the frozen earth. He knew a forgotten secret about the ancient Scandinavian wilderness. He understood a primitive physics that the modern village had entirely cast aside in the name of progress. As the final autumn leaves withered and fell, a strange, eerie quiet settled over the mountain pass. The air grew unnaturally thin, carrying a sharp, metallic scent that made the lungs ache with every deep breath. The elders noticed the local wildlife disappearing from the thick pine forests, fleeing down into the lower valleys. The migratory birds did not just fly south, they fled in frantic, chaotic flocks, as if escaping a burning fire. Old thermometers began a rapid, unstoppable descent into numbers the valley had not seen in over a century. The old-timers muttered about the legendary Arctic Vortex, a rare, mythical, atmospheric monster that sleeps for generations. When it wakes, it descends from the polar north to flatten everything in its path. Gunnar could feel the sudden massive drop in atmospheric pressure deep inside his aching bones. The sky turned a deep, bruised shade of indigo, swallowing the pale winter sun hours before its time. He walked outside into the biting frost to look at his heavy, ugly creation one last time. The living sod on his roof had frozen solid, forming a massive, dark cap over his humble home. Down in the valley, the clean, steep wooden roofs of his neighbors gleamed under the first dusting of fine ice crystals. They looked beautiful, modern, and perfectly safe. But Gunnar knew the terrifying truth of high-velocity mountain winds. He knew that beauty would soon become a fatal weakness. He stepped back inside his cabin, dropped the heavy iron bolt across his thick oak door, and waited for the mountain to break. The preparation began in the scorching heat of late July, when the valley was still lush and green. Gunnar did not begin his work with wood or nails like the traditional builders down in the valley. Instead, he walked deep into the ancient, damp marshes where the birch trees grew thick and gnarled. He carried only a short, curved knife and a wooden mallet worn smooth by decades of hard labor. The air in the marsh was heavy with the sweet, pungent smell of decaying vegetation and wet moss. Mosquitoes swarmed around his face in aggressive clouds, biting at his neck and hands as he worked. He ignored them completely, his eyes locked onto the silver-white trunks of the oldest birch trees. He knew that to build a true protective shield against the coming winter, he needed the skin of the forest. He carefully sliced the outer bark of a massive tree, making a single, perfectly straight vertical cut down its side. With practiced gentleness, he used his wooden mallet to tap the edges, loosening the fibrous skin from the wood. The bark peeled away with a wet, tearing sound that echoed through the quiet woods. It came off in a single, magnificent sheet, curling slightly as the internal tension of the wood was released. Gunnar held the heavy sheet up to the sunlight, inspecting its inner surface with a critical eye. The inner side was a rich golden tan, dripping with natural oils and sticky resins that scented the air. This was the birch tree's natural armor, a substance engineered by nature to withstand centuries of freezing rot. He stacked the heavy sheet carefully on a wooden sled, placing a large rock on top to keep it flat. He spent 3 long, grueling weeks repeating this exact process, stripping bark from hundreds of fallen or carefully selected trees. His hands became permanently stained with black sap, and his back throbbed with a dull, constant ache. Down in the village, the carpenters watched his sled pass by and openly laughed at his primitive burden. They were busy hauling uniform, machine-cut pine planks up from the local sawmill on large wagons. They shouted jokes at Gunnar from their high scaffolding, asking if he planned to build a bird's nest instead of a house. They bragged about their expensive, smooth, tongue-and-groove boards that fit together like pieces of a fine puzzle. Gunnar never answered their taunts, keeping his chin tucked low against his chest as he pulled his heavy sled. He knew what the modern sawmill owners did not understand about the nature of treated wood. Once a tree is cut into perfectly flat boards, its natural grain is broken and exposed to the elements. Over time, the harsh mountain moisture will find every microscopic crack, freezing and expanding until the wood splits open. But birch bark is different because its cellular structure is arranged in tight, cross-layered sheets that block water entirely. Gunnar dragged his massive harvest up the steep rocky path to his isolated cabin at the top of the ridge. The air was already turning crisp as August arrived, bringing cold morning fogs that clung to the valley floor. He began the painstaking process of preparing the structural timber foundation for his heavy roof. He chose dense, slow-grown pine logs that had cured in the shade for over 3 full years. These were not light rafters. They were massive, thick trunks that required his entire bodily strength to move. He notched each heavy log by hand using a sharp broadaxe, cutting deep joints that locked together without a single iron nail. The sound of his axe striking the hard wood was a steady, rhythmic thud that filled the empty mountain air. Every strike sent small, aromatic white chips flying into the dry dirt around his heavy leather boots. He laid the massive roof beams flat across the top of his thick cabin walls, creating a wide, low-angled framework. The angle of his roof was purposefully shallow, a sharp contrast to the steep, dramatic peaks of the village homes below. The villagers pointed at his low roofline and laughed, claiming the first heavy winter snowfall would flatten his house. They did not realize that Gunnar was deliberately preparing his home to carry an unimaginable amount of physical weight. By the time September arrived, the first morning frosts were painting the high ridges in a brilliant, brittle silver. Gunnar climbed up his shaky wooden ladder to begin the most critical phase of his primitive waterproofing. He unrolled the heavy sheets of birch bark across the bare, thick pine log rafters of his roof. He did not lay them down haphazardly. He placed them with the smooth, white outer skin facing downward into the cabin. The golden, resinous inner side of the bark was turned upward, exposed to the open mountain sky. This was the ancient rule of the Scandinavian green roof, an inversion that seemed completely backwards to the untrained eye. By turning the bark upside down, the natural oils would shed water away from the wood beneath, like a flawless hydro dam. He overlapped each sheet by a full 6 inches, creating a shingled pattern that left no gaps for moisture. The bark groaned and crackled under his heavy boots as he walked across the slippery, golden surface. He weighted the edges down with long, heavy pine poles to prevent the autumn winds from lifting his delicate armor. From a distance, his cabin now looked like an upside-down white boat, resting precariously on top of a stone foundation. The villagers shook their heads in pity, convinced the crazy old man had finally lost his mind to the isolation. But Gunnar knew the true test was yet to come, and the mountain air was growing colder by the hour. October descended upon the valley like a heavy iron shroud, stripping the last vibrant colors from the high mountain timberline. The mornings became brutally sharp, the frost no longer just a silver dusting, but a thick, hardened crust of white ice over the dead grass. Gunnar's breath plumed in the freezing dawn air like thick white smoke from a steam engine as he walked out to the marshlands once again. He carried a heavy, flat-bladed iron spade that had belonged to his grandfather, its wooden handle polished dark by generations of calloused hands. He needed the earth itself to protect him from the coming storm, but not just any loose dirt from the valley floor. He sought the dense, tangled, living sod from the high mountain peat bogs, a material woven together by thousands of microscopic, iron-strong roots. This ancient network of roots would hold the soil together even under the most brutal shear forces of a freezing gale. He drove his spade deep into the frozen earth with a violent thrust of his heavy leather boot. The ground resisted fiercely, crunching and snapping under the sharp iron blade like solid bone. Every square block of turf he carved out weighed nearly 50 pounds, heavy with trapped mountain water and dormant plant life. He hoisted the massive, dripping black cubes of earth onto his wooden sled, his ancient muscles burning with a deep, agonizing fire. The freezing mud soaked through his thick wool mittens, numbing his thick, scarred fingers until he could barely feel the wooden handle of his spade. He worked until the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, casting long, menacing shadows across the valley that seemed to swallow the light whole. Hauling the sod up to the cabin was a slow, punishing march against gravity and exhaustion. Gunnar's chest heaved violently with every agonizing step up the steep, rocky incline, his lungs burning as they fought for the thinning, frigid air. Once at the cabin, the true danger of his primitive engineering began. He stood at the base of his crude wooden ladder, a 50-pound block of freezing wet peat balanced precariously on his right shoulder. The wooden rungs groaned and bent under his shifting weight, threatening to snap and send him plummeting to the hard, unforgiving stones below. He reached the edge of the low-angled roof and carefully slid the heavy earth onto the golden, resinous birch bark. He placed the first layer of sod face down, pressing the tangled, dying grass directly against the smooth bark. This specific orientation was crucial, a forgotten piece of wilderness physics that the modern world had ignored. The rotting grass would decompose against the waterproof birch bark, feeding a complex layer of protective soil, while the root system bound the entire mass together. He packed the blocks tightly against each other, eliminating any gaps where the freezing wind could find a foothold. The sheer physical weight he was transferring onto his cabin structure was staggering, accumulating into literal tons of heavy, wet earth. The massive, cured pine logs holding up the roof let out deep, resonant cracks that echoed into the silent forest, settling under the immense, crushing pressure. Down in the warm, brightly lit village, families gathered around their cast-iron stoves, perfectly comfortable under their clean wooden ceilings. They looked up toward the ridge and shook their heads, seeing the old man desperately piling dirt on top of his home like a grave. The village blacksmith boldly declared that Gunnar's entire cabin would collapse in on itself before the first blizzard even arrived. They believed the physical deadload was an act of architectural suicide, a foolish miscalculation by an old man losing his mind to isolation. But Gunnar understood the concept of aerodynamic deadload far better than any modern tradesman in the valley. He knew that the terrifying power of the Arctic Vortex did not destroy houses by pushing them down into the dirt. The true danger of hurricane-force mountain winds was extreme negative pressure, a ferocious upward suction that acted exactly like the lift of a massive airplane wing. When a fast-moving storm sweeps over a steep, clean wooden roof, it creates a violent vacuum that literally rips the structure upward off its wooden pegs. Gunnar was not building a roof to simply block the falling snow. He was building a massive, immovable anchor. He covered the entire surface of the roof with the first inverted layer of thick sod, stopping only to wipe the freezing mud from his tired eyes. The temperature was dropping fast now, the puddles around his cabin freezing solid enough to bear his weight without cracking. He had to move faster before the soil froze completely solid in the bog, rendering his spade useless against the hard tundra. He returned to the marsh under the pale, eerie light of a swollen autumn moon, the wind beginning to whisper through the dead pines with a sinister, low hiss. The storm was not here yet, but the mountain was starting to clear its throat. November arrived with the brutal force of a swinging hammer. The last lingering warmth of autumn was violently stripped from the mountain pass in a single, freezing night. Gunnar woke in the pitch black of early morning to the sound of sleet violently scratching against his tiny glass window panes. He did not light a fire to warm his stiff, aching joints. There was no time left for comfort. He wrapped himself in a heavy, grease-stained sheepskin coat and stepped back out into the biting gray dawn. The first layer of sod was already laid across the birch bark, but the protective shield was only half finished. He now had to complete the second, most crucial layer of his heavy earth roof. For this layer, the thick blocks of peat had to be placed with the living grass facing upward toward the brutal sky. This was the genius of the ancient Scandinavian builders. By placing the two layers of sod grass to grass, the dormant roots would eventually wake in the spring and weave together. They would form a permanent, indestructible biological mesh, locking the entire massive roof into a single, unified block of living earth. But right now, the roots were freezing solid, and the dirt was becoming heavier by the hour. Every block of sod now weighed over 60 pounds, saturated with the freezing, slushy sleet that was falling from the bruised sky. Gunnar's breathing became a harsh, ragged rasp in his throat. His hands were covered in a thick crust of freezing mud and dried blood from scraping against the harsh, frozen earth. The wooden rungs of his ladder were coated in a treacherous, clear layer of black ice. Every trip up to the roof was a deadly gamble. One slip of his heavy leather boot would send him plunging 20 feet down into the jagged, frozen stones surrounding his cabin. Yet he continued to haul the massive, dripping cubes of dirt upward, driven by a primal instinct of survival. Down in the valley, the village chimneys puffed thick, lazy clouds of white pine smoke into the freezing air. The villagers were safely locked inside their modern homes, enjoying hot salted meats and warm spiced cider. They looked out their frosted windows and saw the solitary, dark figure of Gunnar crawling across his roof in the freezing rain like a desperate insect. They pitied him, believing his stubborn pride was driving him toward an early, freezing grave. They did not know that the barometric pressure was continuing to plummet at an unprecedented, terrifying rate. The animals knew. The remaining deer had completely vanished into the deep ravines, seeking the safety of the natural rock caves. Even the hardy mountain ravens had abandoned the sky, leaving the freezing air entirely dead and empty. By the end of the second grueling week of November, the heavy roof was finally complete. Gunnar stood in the freezing mud of his yard, staring up at a solid 3 feet of dense, compacted earth resting on top of his cabin. It was an ugly, towering mass of dead brown grass, black soil, and heavy gray stones he had used to line the edges. But to Gunnar, it was an impenetrable fortress. The massive, dense weight of the soil created an incredible thermal mass, a thick blanket of earth that would trap his cabin's heat inside. Normally, escaping heat would rise through a standard roof, melting the bottom layer of snow and causing disastrous leaks and structural rot. But the thick layer of earth absorbed the escaping warmth, and the inverted birch bark acted as an absolute, flawless vapor barrier. The heavy pine logs supporting the roof groaned one final, long time, settling permanently under the colossal, crushing weight. They did not bow. They did not break. They locked together like a fortress wall, anchored firmly to the stone foundation by the sheer, staggering force of gravity. Gunnar walked up to the side of his cabin and pressed his bare, calloused hand against the thick timber wall. It felt incredibly solid, immovable, like a natural outgrowth of the mountain itself. The sleet finally stopped falling, but it brought no relief. The clouds suddenly tore open, revealing a pale, terrifyingly clear sky. The temperature plummeted so fast that the wet mud on Gunnar's coat instantly crystallized into a hard, rigid shell of ice. A strange, unnatural phenomenon appeared in the sky above the jagged mountain peaks. Two bright, blinding halos of fractured light formed around the pale winter sun, known to the old hunters as sundogs. It was the ultimate, undeniable warning of extreme atmospheric violence. The wind completely died. The air became so perfectly, deeply still, that Gunnar could hear his own heart beating inside his chest. It was a suffocating, heavy silence that made the ears ring. The mountain was holding its breath. The Arctic Vortex had arrived. Gunnar finally retreated into the dark, cramped interior of his heavy wooden sanctuary. He closed the massive oak door behind him, sealing out the pale, unnatural light of the frozen afternoon. With a heavy iron clank, he dropped the thick crossbar into its iron brackets, locking himself inside the belly of the beast. The interior of the cabin was immediately engulfed in a thick, suffocating darkness, broken only by the faint gray light bleeding through the single frosted window. He walked slowly to the stone hearth in the center of the room, his frozen leather boots thudding softly against the packed dirt floor. His hands shook violently with a deep, bone-rattling chill as he struck a piece of high-carbon steel against a sharp chunk of white flint. A shower of bright orange sparks cascaded downward, catching the delicate, paper-thin shavings of dried birch bark he had carefully prepared. A tiny, fragile flame flickered to life, casting long, dancing shadows across the rough-hewn pine logs of his walls. He gently fed the fire with larger split logs, watching the flames grow and listening to the sharp, comforting crackle of burning resin. The sharp, pungent smell of pine smoke quickly filled the small room, a familiar scent that brought a fleeting sense of comfort to the freezing gloom. He sat down heavily on a rough wooden stool, pulling his sheepskin coat tight around his shoulders. Now, there was absolutely nothing left to do but wait. Down in the valley basin, the festive atmosphere of the village was rapidly beginning to curdle into unease. The villagers stopped laughing as the unnatural, heavy silence pressed physically against their eardrums. The smoke rising from their tall stone chimneys did not drift away into the sky. It sank heavily toward the frozen ground, crushed by the plunging atmospheric pressure. Inside their modern, beautifully constructed homes, the cold was beginning to aggressively seep through the sleek wooden walls. Mothers piled heavy wool blankets onto their children, anxiously feeding more expensive coal and dry wood into their glowing iron stoves. But the heat seemed to simply vanish, escaping straight upward through their clean, steep roofs and disappearing into the brutal void. The expensive, machine-cut boards of their ceilings offered zero thermal mass, bleeding their precious warmth into the freezing sky. They gathered closely around their hearths, staring at the creeping white frost that was beginning to crystallize on the inside of their glass windows. A creeping psychological dread began to replace their arrogance. They realized far too late that their modern houses were entirely unprepared for the prehistoric fury that was descending upon them. Back on the high ridge, Gunnar was experiencing the exact opposite physical phenomenon. As the fire roared in his stone hearth, the intense heat rose toward the ceiling, just as it did in the village below. But instead of escaping into the night, the warmth hit the thick, impenetrable ceiling of upside-down birch bark. The heat was trapped instantly within the microscopic pockets of dead air held between the bark and the heavy frozen soil above. The massive 3-foot layer of earth acted as a giant, insulating sponge, absorbing the thermal energy and slowly radiating it back down into the living space. Within an hour, the freezing chill inside the cabin was entirely broken. Gunnar unbuttoned his heavy sheepskin coat, letting it slide off his shoulders as a gentle, stable warmth wrapped around his tired body. He melted a handful of clean snow in a small iron pot, boiling a bitter tea of dried pine needles to soothe his raw throat. He sat completely still in the golden light of the fire, sipping the hot liquid and watching the single candle flame on his table. The heavy pine logs above him let out a low, settling groan as the heat expanded the wood, pressing even tighter against the massive weight of the frozen sod. His primitive engineering was working flawlessly, turning the ceiling into a heavy, thermal vault. But the true test of his survival was not about keeping the cold out. It was about keeping the cabin anchored to the earth. At exactly midnight, the suffocating silence of the mountain pass was finally shattered. It did not start with a gust of wind, but with a deep, terrifying, low-frequency rumble that vibrated through the bedrock itself. It sounded like a massive freight train hurtling blindly through the absolute dark of the surrounding pine forest. Gunnar placed his empty iron cup down on the table, his eyes locked dead ahead on the heavy wooden door. The candle flame on the table suddenly flickered as the barometric pressure in the room dropped violently. Outside, the frozen tops of the ancient pine trees began to snap with loud, explosive cracks that echoed like rifle fire across the dark valley. The Arctic Vortex had finally crested the high mountain peak, spilling over the jagged rocks like an invisible, freezing tidal wave. A colossal, screaming wall of pure atmospheric violence slammed down into the valley floor. The air turned white instantly, a blinding blizzard of razor-sharp ice crystals moving at over 100 miles per hour. Gunnar gripped the edges of his wooden stool as the ground beneath his feet physically shuddered. The monster was here. The full fury of the polar vortex hit the ridge like a detonating bomb. A relentless, screaming wall of wind slammed directly into the front of Gunnar's cabin, trying to tear the ancient logs apart. The colossal kinetic energy of the storm shook the heavy stone foundation, sending a deep shudder through the packed dirt floor. Inside, the single candle flame violently danced but did not go out. Outside, the air had turned into a chaotic, white vortex of pulverizing ice and debris. The wind tore through the thick pine forest, shearing massive, century-old trunks in half like fragile toothpicks. Huge boulders were dislodged from the high cliffs, tumbling down into the dark ravines with a dull roar. The noise was absolute, a deafening mechanical shriek that filled every inch of the night. It sounded as if the mountain itself was being torn apart at the seams. Gunnar sat perfectly rigid on his wooden stool, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his table. He looked up at the ceiling, watching the massive pine logs hold firm against the crushing weight of the storm. He could hear the savage wind screaming as it hit the front of his low-angled roofline. But instead of lifting the structure, the wind seemed to slide off into the dark. Down in the basin, the village was experiencing an absolute, terrifying architectural nightmare. The fast-moving Arctic gale swept across the flat valley floor, accelerating as it funneled through the narrow mountain pass. When this high-velocity wall of air hit the steep, modern wooden roofs of the village homes, it triggered a lethal principle of aerodynamics. Because their roofs were built with a steep, dramatic pitch, they acted exactly like massive, rigid sails, catching the wind. As the fierce wind slammed into the windward side of the steep roofs, it was forced to accelerate rapidly up and over the peak. This sudden increase in velocity created a massive drop in air pressure directly above the roof's surface. Inside the houses, the air pressure remained completely normal, trapping a bubble of high-pressure air beneath the ceilings. The resulting physical force was an immense, violent upward suction known to modern engineers as aerodynamic lift. The steep, beautiful roofs were not being pushed down by the storm. They were being violently sucked upward into the sky. With a succession of loud structural explosions, the expensive, machine-cut pine planks began to split and tear away from their frames. Iron nails were ripped out of the groaning timbers with terrifying force, flying through the dark like lethal shrapnel. The village blacksmith's home was the very first to break under the immense negative pressure. With a horrific, tearing crash, his entire steep wooden roof was lifted completely off its foundation, flipped into the air, and smashed to pieces against the frozen ground. The freezing blizzard instantly flooded into the exposed house, burying his family beneath a mountain of fast-moving ice and snow. One by one, the modern, sleek roofs of his neighbors began to fail in the exact same catastrophic manner. The beautiful, shaved pine boards that the villagers had bragged about were peeled away like cheap paper, exposing them to the lethal frost. Families screamed in the darkness, abandoning their collapsing homes and fleeing into the freezing night. Desperate to find shelter from the flying debris, they ran blindly through the blinding whiteout, their hands outstretched as they searched for any structure that was still standing. Through the swirling curtain of snow, they looked up toward the high ridge, expecting to see Gunnar's primitive cabin entirely destroyed. To their absolute shock, the dark, ugly mound of earth was still there. It was sitting perfectly unmoved on top of the ridge, completely unaffected by the savage gale that was tearing their world apart. The incredible survival of Gunnar's cabin was the result of a brilliant, hidden masterclass in primitive physics. While the steep roofs of the village created an aerodynamic vacuum that lifted them into the air, Gunnar's low-pitched roof did the opposite. The shallow 12-degree angle of his roofline allowed the fast-moving wind to glide smoothly over the top without creating a massive drop in pressure. More importantly, his roof was carrying a crushing secret weapon, the 3 feet of dense, heavy peat sod. This massive 3-ton layer of frozen earth created an immense physical force known as structural deadload. The sheer weight of the frozen dirt acted as a massive, immovable anchor that completely countered the upward suction of the storm. But the true genius of the ancient Scandinavian green roof lay in how it interacted with the fierce wind itself. As the high-velocity gale swept over the low mound of earth, the aerodynamic pressure actually compressed the heavy sod down onto the cabin. The stronger the wind blew, the harder it pressed the dense layer of earth down against the thick birch bark and pine logs. The storm was not tearing the roof off. It was using its own terrifying power to lock the house tighter into the mountain. Inside the warm cabin, Gunnar walked over to his small frosted window and looked out into the chaotic white darkness. He could see the vague, frantic shapes of his neighbors stumbling up the steep, icy path toward his ridge. They were shivering violently, wrapped in torn blankets and covered in thick crusts of freezing ice. Gunnar did not hesitate. He walked to the heavy door, lifted the thick oak crossbar, and pulled the door open against the howling wind. The freezing gale roared into the room, threatening to blow out his fire, but he planted his heavy boots and held the door wide. The desperate villagers poured into the stable, glowing warmth of his home, collapsing onto his packed dirt floor in absolute exhaustion. They looked up at the massive, groaning pine beams above their heads, realizing they were completely safe beneath the heavy mound of dirt. The very material they had laughed at, the ugly blocks of wet marsh peat, was the only thing keeping them alive. The deep, steady heat radiated down from the thick ceiling, slowly warming their frozen limbs and stopping their violent shivering. The village elders looked at Gunnar with tears of shame and gratitude freezing on their pale cheeks. They had built for pride and beauty, but the old carpenter had built for survival. For 12 long, agonizing hours, the Arctic Vortex battered the mountain pass with undiminished, terrifying fury. The villagers huddled closely around Gunnar's stone hearth, listening to the relentless roar of the wind above their heads. But the cabin did not move a single inch under the crushing weight of the historic storm. The thick layers of upside-down birch bark remained completely intact, preventing the melting snow from rotting the structural timbers below. The natural oils in the bark acted as a permanent, waterproof shield, holding back the immense moisture of the frozen peat. As the long night finally began to fade into a pale, freezing dawn, the screaming wind began to lose its violent edge. The deafening roar slowly subsided into a low, hollow moan that echoed through the ruined pine forests. Gunnar stepped out onto his low roof, looking down into the devastated valley basin below. The modern village was entirely gone, reduced to a chaotic graveyard of shattered wood and collapsed walls. Only his ugly, heavy, living green roof remained, standing tall against the sky like an ancient monument to a forgotten science. The sun finally broke through the bruised clouds, just past mid-morning. It cast a blinding, brilliant light over a completely unrecognizable, frozen landscape. The valley basin below was a scene of absolute, silent devastation. Every steep, modern roof that had stood so proudly yesterday was entirely gone. They had been violently stripped, shattered into jagged splinters, and scattered like discarded matchsticks. The arrogant village of shaved pine had been erased by the brutal physics of the high mountain. Gunnar stood in the fresh snow at the edge of his ridge, his breath pluming softly in the frigid air. The surviving villagers gathered silently behind him, wrapped tightly in his heavy animal furs. They stared down at the scattered ruins of their modern arrogance, the profound silence ringing in their frostbitten ears. No one spoke a single word. There was absolutely nothing left to say. They turned their heads to look back at the ugly, low-slung timber cabin that had just saved their lives. The thick mound of frozen earth on the roof was now covered in a smooth blanket of white snow. It no longer looked like a primitive, poorly constructed house. It looked like a natural extension of the mountain itself, deeply rooted into the bedrock and fiercely eternal. This is the profound, undeniable genius of our forgotten ancestors. Modern men often look back at ancient builders and see only primitive tools and desperate poverty. We mistakenly believe that our clean architectural lines and uniform wooden boards make us vastly superior to the wild. But our ancestors did not build to conquer nature or to boast vainly of their material wealth. They built strictly to survive her absolute, uncompromising wrath. They understood the complex mechanics of aerodynamic pressure, thermal mass, and natural vapor barriers centuries before modern engineers gave them scientific names. They knew that when you live in a world governed by extreme forces, you do not build a rigid, steep wall and dare the wind to knock it down. Instead, you build an immovable anchor. You take the heaviest, wettest earth you can carry and use the crushing weight of gravity to hold you fast. You take the golden, waterproof inner skin of the ancient birch tree and invert it against the rot. You let the fierce, screaming wind compress you deeper into the welcoming safety of the earth. The old ways of survival were never born of ignorance. They were forged slowly in the brutal, unforgiving crucible of life and death. Today, the sleek, steep wooden roofs have returned to the mountain valleys, heavily reinforced by industrial steel. But deep in the isolated passes, the brilliant physics of the wilderness still silently wait in the quiet shadows. Survival secrets remain hidden beneath the heavy green moss and the upside-down birch bark of ancient timber cabins. These are the lost, invaluable methods of those who chose to listen to the earth instead of trying to silence it. If you found yourself captivated by the quiet, enduring brilliance of Gunnar's green roof, do not let your journey end here. Subscribe to this channel to uncover more forgotten historical mysteries, primitive engineering masterpieces, and ancient wilderness survival tactics. Join us as we continue to resurrect the brilliant, lost science of our greatest ancestors. Leave a comment below telling us if you would trust an ancient, heavy earth roof to protect your family in a winter storm. The harsh winds of the high mountains will always return to howl against the timber. Make sure you know exactly how to stay anchored to the earth when they finally arrive.